Thank you so very much. It's a tremendous privilege to be with you today. This Sunday, I see many good friends and people who've been encouraging and supportive of my candidacy for Lieutenant Governor, and it's an honor to be with you and spend a few minutes talking about some of the issues that you're concerned about and that we're all concerned about at every level of state government. I want to start by talking a little bit about myself. My Grandma Shafer, if she were alive today, would be 105 years old. She was born in 1912, passed away 10 years ago. She lived 95 years. She was the mother of 7 children, including my dad, who was her third child. And in the early 1950s, she lost her husband, the man who was my granddad, Shafer, in a workplace accident that left her the single mother of 7 small children. Now, this was a full 15 years before the Great Society, so she got a widow's benefit from Social Security, but that was basically it. She went to work to support her family. She cleaned motel rooms at a nearby motor lodge, and she was a lunch lady at the local elementary school, and her children worked. My dad and his brothers each worked part-time jobs. I don't know where it is today, but I remember when I was a child and we would visit my Grandma Shafer's house, my dad would point to this giant glass jar in the kitchen, and he would tell me that at the end of each week, he and his brothers would deposit their weekly earnings in that jar, and from that jar, the common expenses of the family were paid. That affected me too. When I was 13 years old, I went to work. My dad got me a job as a janitor at a local church. I did not have to put the money in a glass jar to pay the common expenses of the family. I got to keep my $10 a week, but it was critically important to my dad because of the way he had been raised, that his son understand 2 things: that all work is good, and that there's no type of work, not cleaning toilets or scrubbing floors, that is beneath anyone. I agree with Ronald Reagan. The very best social program is a job, and my public service has been animated by trying to create an environment here in Georgia where business flourishes, where jobs are created, and where the people are ready to work. And I've done that in cooperation with you. When I was elected to the state Senate in 2002, the Senate district I ran in that included parts of Gwinnett and Forsyth and Fulton County included 15 cities, almost 100 elected officials who I worked with when I was first elected. And in the time that I've been in the state Senate, I've been involved in the creation of additional cities. I was involved with the formation of Sandy Springs, and later of Johns Creek, and of Milton, and then of Peachtree Corners in DeKalb County. I co-sponsored the legislation that created the city of Dunwoody. My public service really has been guided by 2 principles. One is that decisions ought to be made at the closest level to the people who are impacted, and that the local governments that we set up need to have every tool available to them to secure the prosperity and the safety of their citizens. And that's why I've 3 times been named a champion of Georgia cities and have nearly 200 mayors and city council members who've endorsed me for lieutenant governor, because I see the relationship between the state and the local governments to be one of cooperation, where we're supporting and bolstering you. Of course, my legislative accomplishments have been much broader than that. I introduced legislation that moved the state to a system of zero-based budgeting. When I was first elected to the state Senate in 2002, when they would put the budget of the state on our desks, a document about this thick, that document only described about 3% of the state spending, the new programs. And once a new program was approved by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor, it automatically rolled over into each succeeding budget of the state under a single line item called continuation. I introduced the very first term I was elected legislation that moved us away from continuation budgeting to zero-based budgeting, where the entire budget would have to be rejustified, not just and explained, not just the new programs, but programs that have been approved years or even decades earlier. They would have to be explained and re-justified to make sure that they were still needed. I sponsored the constitutional amendment that put a cap on the state income tax, that makes sure that our income tax will go no higher. I would like to see it lowered. We've got the highest income tax in the southeast United States, but we are the only state in the union, thanks to that constitutional amendment, that gives businesses that are looking to expand here or to come here a constitutional guarantee that the income tax will go no higher. I sponsored legislation that requires the periodic re-justification of regulation. I sponsored legislation that completely rewrote or modernized for the first time in 30 years the HMO code. About 8 years ago, and I worked closely with the GMA on this, I wrote legislation that updated our telecom laws that recognized that the cable companies and the telephone companies had basically converged into offering the same services. I sponsored legislation that put into law a Corporate Good Samaritan Act that encouraged corporations to provide free assistance in times of declared emergencies. I have spent the 15 years that I have served in the General Assembly working hard on issues that I believe positively impact the citizens that you represent on the local level and that we represent on the state level. And I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish in collaboration with you. I appreciate this opportunity to address your organization. I appreciate y'all taking time from your conference to come listen to us, and thank you so very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you so much for those comments. Ms. Proba, we'll go to you with your first question.
Last year, the governor and you and your colleagues at the General Assembly gave dramatic pay increases to the Georgia State Patrol. Do you support state-mandated compensation levels for municipal law enforcement personnel?
I do not believe that the Constitution allows us to set compensation for municipalities, for local governments. It's pretty clear that the Constitution says that the compensation level for all local employees, and that would include public safety employees, is a prerogative of the local government. I don't know that that necessarily applies to the sheriffs or the deputy sheriffs, because the sheriff is a state-created, is an office created by the state constitution, and so are his deputies. I introduced or co-sponsored a constitutional amendment in the last session of the General Assembly that would have attempted to deal with the problem of law enforcement compensation, which I do believe needs to be increased, by authorizing the state to provide an earned income tax credit where state dollars would be used to bolster the compensation through the tax system of local law enforcement officials. I think that's the only way that we really, on the state level, can impact local law enforcement compensation. I do believe that law enforcement is underpaid, and I do recognize that the dramatic increase in the compensation of the state patrol, which I supported, does put competitive pressure on the local governments. But I think that needs to be addressed in a cooperative and constitutionally appropriate way.
Thank you. Ms. Nolan, you have our final question.
All right. A bill has been introduced that would allow localities to decide how best to proceed with their Confederate monuments, many of which have been criticized as enshrining the so-called lost cause sentiment. The proposal would let individual communities choose whether to keep monuments as is or relocate them, as some cities elsewhere in the country have done. What is your position on this? As Lieutenant Governor, would you encourage an open debate on the issue?
Well, so, I'm certainly for an open debate on any issue, even issues where I have a opposing viewpoint. The Confederate Monument Law was actually enacted in the same legislation that changed the state flag. And the argument then was that the symbolism of the state flag needed to be changed, but the proponents of that particular change said, but it won't impact, this change won't impact any of the, the monuments to the Confederacy or anything else in the heritage of the country. And so that was part of a compromise that was worked out in 2001 when the state flag was changed, and certainly anyone has a right to introduce legislation that would change that compromise, but that's how that law came about in 2001.
Thank you. We'll reset the clock, and now you have 2 minutes to give us your closing remarks.
I will close out with a admission to you that when I was a youngster, I struggled in Sunday school. I had a hard time with some of the central lessons of my faith, the parables in particular. I had a hard time understanding the wisdom of leaving 99 sheep unguarded because one sheep had run away. I had a real problem with the runaway son getting the feast and the dutiful son having to do all the work to prepare it. I had a real problem with turning the other cheek. I could see potentially running away if you weren't going to strike back, but to stand there and allow yourself to being hit over and over again, all of those parables required explanation for me to understand. But there was one parable that I understood immediately without any explanation at all, and it's the parable of the talents. And for those of you who teach Sunday school, remember Sunday school, in the parable of the talents, a wealthy man goes on a long journey and takes his fortune and divides it into 3 shares and entrusts each share of his fortune into the hands of a different manager, one of whom takes his share of the fortune and buries it in the ground for safekeeping. The second of whom takes his share of the fortune and deposits it in the biblical equivalent of a bank to earn interest. And the third of whom takes his share of the fortune and buys fields and flocks. No one had to explain to me that the guy who had buried the treasure in the ground had missed an opportunity, and that the one who had bought fields and flocks had done right. I view, and I know that many of you do as well, I view my public service through the prism of that parable. The titles that we hold and that we seek, whether it's council member or mayor or representative or senator or lieutenant governor, those titles in and of themselves don't mean anything. They're like treasure buried in the ground. It's what we do with them. And I pledge in the year I've got left as a
Time's
state
up.
senator, and if I get a chance to be your lieutenant governor, that I'll spend each and every day trying to advance the values that we share.
Thank you
so
so
very
much. We appreciate all of our candidates for being here.